Good morning, my lady. I am Advocate Kimani, and I appear on behalf of the plaintiff, Ms. Sakala. My lady, this is a claim for personal injury arising out of a road traffic accident that was caused by the defendant's negligence. There is only one issue before the court today. And the issue before the court is whether the road traffic accident was caused by the defendant's negligence. It has been agreed that the quantum of plaintiff's damages will stand over for later determination if the plaintiff is able to prove her case on the merits. The plaintiff intends to call one witness, Ms. Sakala, the plaintiff herself, who will testify to the circumstances surrounding the road traffic accident. Now, there were two parties involved in the road traffic accident that took place on the morning of the 21st of April, 2015. One of them, Ms. Sakala, the plaintiff, was a pedestrian. And the other is Mr. Chauke, the defendant, who was driving the motor vehicle involved in the collision. Now, when this collision occurred, the parties were traveling on Main Road, Rwanda-Bosch. The plaintiff, Ms. Sakala, is a student at the University of Cape Town. She is studying law, and she is in the final year of her studies.
You mean the plaintiff or the defendant?
The plaintiff.
The plaintiff.
Yes.
Yes. I thought you referred to her as Ms. Sakala.
Ms. Sakala, the plaintiff.
Ms. Sakala, yes.
Most obliged, my lady.
Please proceed.
Thank you, my lady. Next year, Ms. Sakala, the plaintiff, intends to start her articles at a law firm in Johannesburg. Now, on the 21st of April, the day of the collision, Ms. Sakala was traveling to UCT by taxi to attend her classes. And she disembarked from the taxi. I call the court's attention to Plaintiff Exhibit 1, which shows the layout of how the road was laid out that morning of the accident. Ms. Sakala disembarked from the taxi at the intersection between Main Road and Woolsack Road. She waited on the sidewalk until it was safe to cross the road. Now, there were a number of other pedestrians who were also waiting on the sidewalk, just as she was. While she was waiting, she observed the defendant's vehicle traveling towards her on Main Road, but there appeared to be a sufficient gap between her position and that of the defendant for her to safely cross the road. And so she started crossing the road. All of a sudden, she was hit by the defendant's vehicle, which had overtaken the taxi and collided with her as she was crossing the road. As a result of this collision, Ms. Sakala sustained several serious injuries. She suffered a minor head injury, a severe injury to her right leg, and 4 fractured ribs. Now, the plaintiff's case is that the defendant's negligence was the sole cause of this accident. The defendant, in failing to adequately adjust his speed in response to the proximity of pedestrians, and in response to the proximity of a passenger taxi, fell below the standard of care that is expected of a reasonable and prudent driver. It was therefore that defendant's negligence that caused the accident, which caused Ms. Sakala such significant harm. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you. Is Advocate Owen, do you have an opening statement to make? Please proceed.
May it please the court, my name is Henry Owen, and I appear on behalf of the defendant, Ntokozo Chauke. My lady, the plaintiff alleges that it was the defendant's negligent driving that caused the road traffic accident. Mr. Chauke admits that indeed he was involved in a collision with the plaintiff, but he denies categorically that he was negligent or that his alleged negligence contributed to the said accident. The burden of proof in this matter lies with the plaintiff to show that the conduct of the defendant fell below that of any prudent and reasonable driver. The plaintiff must show that the defendant was indeed negligent, or in the alternative, that his negligence contributed to the road traffic accident. In the alternative, and if the court finds that the defendant's alleged negligence caused the road traffic accident, the defendant alleges that the plaintiff was contributorily negligent. And in that case, the onus would be on the defendant. The defense is going to call only one witness, the defendant himself, Mr. Ntokozo Chauke. Mr. Ntokozo is 48 years old. He is married to Ntondo Chauke, and they have been married for 22 years now. He is employed as a chartered accountant with KPMG, where he has been working for 16 years now. Mr. Chauke has been driving since he was 18 years old and has only ever received one conviction for driving, in which he got only a fine as a sentence. My lady, Mr. Chauke's case is that he was traveling on Main Road, Rwanda-Bosch, while driving to work on the morning of 21st of April, 2015. He was driving behind a minibus taxi when it veered right and pulled over to the side of the road. That was near the intersection between Woolsack Road and Main Road, Rwanda-Bosch. I call the court's attention to the plaintiff's to the document labeled Plaintiff Exhibit 1. The taxi veered right and pulled over to the sidewalk near the intersection between Woolsack Road and Main Road. After observing that there was a safe gap and there was no car approaching from the other lane, from the opposite lane, Mr. Chauke decided to overtake the taxi because, as he will testify, the taxi was driving erratically. Mr. Chauke then accelerated to 40 kilometers per hour in order to safely overtake the taxi. And at that point, when he decided to accelerate in order to overtake the taxi, a pedestrian, the plaintiff, ran into the path of his vehicle as he was overtaking the taxi. This is despite the fact that there is a pedestrian crossing merely 50 meters away from the intersection. There's a pedestrian crossing, my lady, just 50 meters away. Despite slamming on his brakes as soon as he saw the pedestrian, he was unable to avoid a collision and he collided with the plaintiff. Therefore, the defense's case is that Mr. Chauke was traveling at a safe speed, well below the speed limit, when the plaintiff ran into the path of his vehicle and caused the accident. The plaintiff's negligence in failing to use the demarcated pedestrian crossing and in crossing the road in front of the defendant's vehicle as he was overtaking another vehicle was the sole and alternatively the primary cause of the accident. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you. Yes, Advocate Kimani, do you have any witnesses to call?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, please proceed and call your first witness.
May it please the court, I call the plaintiff, Ms. Sakala. Please tell the court your name.
Atupele Jess Sakala.
What is your address?
I stay at 7 Alma Road, Observatory.
And how long have you lived there?
I moved in at the beginning of this year, but I used to stay at the Talgor residence.
If the witness could kindly raise her voice for the court to be able to record. Thank you. And how old are you, Ms. Sakala?
I'm 22 years old.
What do you do?
I'm a student at the University of Cape Town.
What are you studying?
I'm completing my law degree.
Could you tell the court what you were doing on the morning of the 21st of April, 2015?
I was taking a minibus taxi to Rondebosch so that I could catch a jammy shuttle to UCT's middle campus since I had a lecture at 9 a.m.
And what time did you leave for class?
I left my home around 20 minutes to 9 a.m.
How long does it normally take you to get to middle campus from your house?
It normally takes me about 30 minutes to get to campus.
Please describe the route that you took on the morning of the 21st of April, 2015.
After exiting my house on Alma Road, I walked to Main Road Observatory and got onto a minibus taxi. The taxi continued along Main Road, stopping occasionally to collect more passengers or allow other passengers to disembark. It took the taxi about 15 minutes to get to Rondebosch. When the taxi neared the intersection between Main Road Rondebosch and Woolsack Road, I signaled to the driver to stop. The taxi pulled over to the side of the road and stopped near the sidewalk, just a few meters before the intersection. I got off the taxi and waited on the sidewalk until I could cross safely.
I call the court's attention once again to the document labeled Plaintiff Exhibit 1. Ms. Sakala, please look at the diagram that is labeled Plaintiff Exhibit 1. Does this diagram fairly and accurately represent the way the road was laid out the morning of the accident?
Yes.
Please demonstrate on the diagram the route that the taxi was traveling and where it pulled over and stopped.
The taxi was traveling south on Main Road and had just passed the pedestrian crossing. The taxi stopped just as is indicated on the diagram, right before the intersection of Main Road and Woolsack Road.
And what was happening on the sidewalk after you got off the taxi?
There were a number of other pedestrians on the sidewalk when I got off the taxi, and a couple of other people also got off the taxi at the same time as me.
How many people were on the sidewalk that morning?
There were quite a number of people. I can't be sure of the exact number, but there were definitely more than 10.
What were these people doing?
Some of them were walking along the sidewalk, but most of them appeared to be waiting along the sidewalk so they could safely cross Main Road.
How many people are usually waiting in this area to cross the road in the mornings when you're going to campus?
This particular area of Main Road always has a high amount of pedestrian traffic in the morning, since there's a jammy stop at the Tagore residence on the other side of Main Road. Students using the train or taxis to travel to campus need to cross Main Road in order to reach the jammy stop and get to campus.
My ladies, my lords, the jammy bus is the sole UCT mode of transport that is used to transport students and the staff from their residences to campus and to town and various points in the city. Ms. Sakala, once again, please demonstrate on this diagram where you were standing as you're waiting to cross the road.
After I got out of the taxi, I walked around to the front of the taxi and waited on the sidewalk. I was very close between the intersection of Main Road and Woolsack Road.
And where were the other pedestrians who were waiting to cross Main Road?
Some of them were waiting at the pedestrian crossing. However, most of them were waiting along other points of the road. A couple of other people, those who had just gotten off the taxi, were waiting at the same spot as me.
And what happened next?
I was waiting on the sidewalk and looking left and right to check that it was safe to cross the road. There was a car approaching the lane There was a car in the lane closest to me. There was a reasonably large gap between my position in the road and the car. The car was about 100 meters away from me and was traveling at a moderate speed. There were no cars approaching in the other lane, and so I decided that there was enough time for me to cross the road. I stepped off the sidewalk and started walking across the road in front of the taxi. As I stepped past the taxi, I saw the same car speeding towards me. I froze, but the driver didn't stop or do anything.
Then what happened next?
The car kept coming towards me, and it hit me on my right side. I don't remember anything after that. The next thing I remember, I was in Grootskeur Hospital.
Ms. Sakala, could you describe the vehicle that you saw approaching your position as you're waiting on the sidewalk?
It was a Toyota, and it was red in color.
And what did the car that collided with you look like?
It was the same car, a red Toyota.
How fast was this car traveling when you first saw it?
When I first saw the vehicle before I started crossing the road, it was traveling at a moderate speed.
What is it that you mean by moderate speed?
It was moving quite slowly, but I can't tell you the exact speed.
And how fast was the car traveling when you saw it again right before the collision?
It was traveling at a very fast speed.
What did you do when you saw the car speeding towards you right before the collision?
I couldn't do anything. I was completely frozen.
Finally, Ms. Sakala, please describe to the court the kind of injuries that you sustained as a result of this accident.
I had suffered a minor head injury. I also had a severe injury to my right leg, which needed surgery, and 4 fractured ribs on my right-hand side. I spent 2 months in hospital and a further 6 months in recovery, undergoing physiotherapy. I missed 8 weeks of class and wasn't able to write my June exams.
Thank you, Ms. Sakala. I have no further questions. You will now be asked some questions by the defendant's counsel. Thank you.
Yes. Advocate Owen, any cross-examination?
Ms. Sakala, do you usually travel to campus by taxi?
Yes.
And do you often take the route that you used on the 21st of April 2015?
Yes.
Do you often cross the road near the intersection
You
between...
want to slow down a little bit. I'm recording your questions. Can't forget.
All right.
Yes. Please proceed.
Ms. Sakala, do you often take the route that you took on the 21st of April 2015?
Yes.
And do you usually cross the road near the intersection between Woolsack Road and Main Road?
Yes.
So you are aware that there is a pedestrian crossing in close proximity to the intersection?
Yes.
You did not cross the road at the designated pedestrian crossing that morning, did you?
No, I didn't.
But you are aware that Main Road is one of the busy thoroughfares in Cape Town
Yes.
and is often very busy.
Yes.
You are also aware that between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. is peak time when there is very heavy traffic on Main Road.
Yes.
And therefore, it would have been difficult to cross Main Road at peak times without the use of the designated pedestrian crossing, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Your class was starting at 9 a.m. that morning, right?
That's correct.
But you left your house at 20 to 9, and yet it usually takes you 30 minutes to get to campus, correct?
Yes.
So it is safe to say that you were running late for your class that morning,
Yes.
and therefore you were in a rush to get to class, weren't you?
Yes.
So because you were in a rush to get to class, you would have been in a hurry to cross the road as quickly as possible.
Yes.
You said that my client's vehicle was approaching your position on the road before you decided to cross the road. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
So you decided to cross the road even though you were aware that my client was using the road at the same time.
Yes, but the Toyota was traveling slowly and far away from me when I decided to cross the road.
Please confine your answers to my questions. Did you decide to use the road even though you were aware that my client's vehicle was approaching your position?
Yes.
And you were aware that you would have been hidden from the view of oncoming traffic when you entered the road in front of the taxi.
Yes.
Please raise your voice for the record of the court.
Yes, I was aware of that.
So you were aware that any oncoming traffic would not be able to see you until you had passed the taxi.
Yes.
You say that you looked left and right to check if it was safe to cross the road before you entered the road. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And this is when you first saw my client's vehicle approaching your position?
Yes.
And thereafter, you stepped into the road and walked in front of the taxi.
Yes.
Could you still see my client's vehicle?
No, it was blocked from my view by the taxi.
And once you had walked past the taxi and the road was no longer blocked from view, did you look right again to check the position of my client's vehicle?
No.
You stepped into the path of oncoming traffic without checking right to check whether it was safe to cross the road at that moment?
Yes.
Ms. Sakala, you say that you saw my client's vehicle right before the collision and that it was traveling at a fast speed, correct?
Correct.
How did you judge my client's speed?
I estimated the speed.
For how long did you see my client's vehicle before it collided with you?
Not long.
There was very little time between your seeing my client's vehicle and the collision, wasn't there?
Yes.
So it would not have been possible to accurately estimate my client's speed, would it?
I can't tell you the exact speed, but I know the vehicle was traveling at a much faster speed than before.
No further questions.
Thank you. Do you have any questions in re-examination? Yes.
Ms. Sakala, why didn't you use the pedestrian crossing that morning?
It was more convenient for me to cross where the taxi had stopped, rather than to walk back to the pedestrian crossing. Also, there was a large gap in traffic, which would have given me enough time to cross the road safely without using the pedestrian crossing.
Why did you decide to cross the road when there was a vehicle approaching your position?
The defendant's car was the only car approaching me, and it was quite far away at the time when I decided to cross. I expected the vehicle to maintain the same speed, so there would have been plenty of time for me to cross the road safely.
Please explain again why you didn't check left and right again once your view was no longer obscured by the taxi.
I had checked previously before entering the street. Like I've said, the defendant's car was the only car approaching my position, and it was quite far away when I checked. I could not have envisioned that it would have accelerated so suddenly. I would not have expected a driver to accelerate with so many pedestrians trying to cross the road.
Ms. Sakala, how often are students late for a class?
Very often, at least a couple of students walk in late during every class.
And how often have you been late yourself at your time at the university?
I wouldn't say I'm regularly late, but it does happen on occasion.
So what do you do when you're late for a class?
Our classes are quite large, so it's quite easy to slip into the lecture theatre without disturbing the lectures. If I've missed anything, I always ask one of my friends for their lecture notes.
So how much of an impact do you think being late for class that morning had on your decisions?
Not much. I was trying to get to class quickly, but I didn't take any risks. I crossed the road when I did because it appeared to be safe to do so.
Thank you, Ms. Sakala. My ladies, my lords, that is the close of the plaintiff's case. Thank you.
Defendant's case.
May it please the court? I call the defendant, Mr. Chauke. Please tell the court your name.
Ntokozo Chauke.
Are you married, Mr. Chauke?
Yes.
What is your spouse's name?
Ntando Chauke.
Where do you live?
I live at 19 Chapel Road, Mulberry.
And how long have you lived there?
I have lived there for some 20 years now.
How old are you, Mr. Chauke?
I am 48 years old.
What is your occupation?
I'm a chartered accountant at KPMG.
Do you have a driver's license?
Yes, I have a driver's license.
How long have you been driving?
I have been driving from the age of 18, so that makes it 30 years now.
Do you have any convictions for driving?
Yes, I was convicted for driving under the influence of intoxicating liquor in 1996.
How old were you at that time?
I was 28 years old.
Was anyone hurt in the incident?
No.
What sentence did you get?
I received a fine.
Could you please tell the court what you were doing between 8:30 a.m. and 9 a.m. on the morning of 21st April 2015?
I was driving to my place of work at Claremont.
What vehicle were you driving?
I was driving a red Toyota Corolla.
What were the road conditions like that morning?
The road conditions were fine.
And the weather conditions?
The weather conditions were also fine.
Please describe the conditions in more detail.
On that particular morning, it was a clear and sunny day. There was no rain or mist.
How far is your place of work from your home?
It's usually about a 30 minutes drive to my place of work, but can take a bit longer with heavy traffic.
What time did you leave your home to travel for work?
I left my place at 8:30 a.m.
And at what time did you need to be at work?
I start work at 9 a.m.
What route do you normally take to travel to work?
Immediately after leaving Chapel Road, I join Main Road, which leads directly to Claremont. Main Road is a long and straight road that leads directly to Claremont. It is one of the main thoroughfares in Cape Town and can often have very busy traffic with people traveling from and to Claremont.
How often do you take this route?
I take the route every day.
Is this the route that you took on 21st of April 2015?
Yes.
What were the traffic conditions like that morning?
The traffic conditions were moderate, but the traffic was free-flowing.
What happened on your way to work that morning?
I was involved in a collision with a pedestrian.
Where did the collision occur?
The collision occurred on Main Road in Rondebosch, between Woolsack Road and Ryan Road.
My lords, my ladies, I call the court's attention once again to Plaintiff's Exhibit 1. Mr. Chauke, does the diagram marked as Plaintiff Exhibit 1 fairly and accurately represent the layout of the road?
Yes.
Please use the diagram to describe the stretch of the road where the accident occurred.
As you can see, Main Road has 2 lanes. There is a set of traffic lights on the intersection on Woolsack Road and Main Road. There is also, further back, a demarcated pedestrian crossing with its own set of traffic lights between Ryan Road and Woolsack Road and Main Road, sorry.
Had you noticed the pedestrian crossing before?
Yes, I see the pedestrian crossing every day when I go to work.
How often have you observed pedestrians using the pedestrian crossing to cross Main Road?
I see the pedestrians using the pedestrian crossing every day because Main Road is often quite busy and the pedestrian crossing is the safest way to cross Main Road.
How far away from the pedestrian crossing did the collision occur?
The collision occurred about 50 meters away from the pedestrian crossing.
And how did the collision occur?
I was driving along Main Road, traveling south on the direction of Claremont, when a minibus taxi pulled in front of me at some point in Rondebosch. The taxi was driving very erratically, stopping suddenly to pick up passengers and leave other passengers behind. I kept a distance of about 50 meters away from the taxi because I was concerned about its erratic driving. About 20 meters away from the intersection between Woolsack Road and Main Road in Rondebosch, the taxi stopped and veered to the side of the road to disembark a few passengers.
What did you do then?
When the taxi pulled over to the side of the road, I slowed down to about 20 kilometers per hour. As I neared the taxi, I observed in the other lane, traveling in the opposite direction that I was taking, that there was no oncoming traffic. So I decided to move to the center of the road with an intention of overtaking the taxi. The front of my vehicle was nearly level to the taxi when the pedestrian suddenly ran in the path of my vehicle and the collision happened. I slammed on my horns and slammed on the brakes, but there was nothing I could do to avoid the collision.
Mr. Chauke, how far away from the taxi were you when it stopped on the side of the road?
I was maintaining a following distance of about 50 meters. I slowed down when the taxi veered to the side of the road and could still maintain a distance of about 50 meters or so.
And at what point did you decide to overtake the taxi?
I decided to overtake the taxi when I was about 20 meters away from the taxi.
How fast were you driving when you overtook the taxi?
I had slowed down to about 20 kilometers per hour when I saw the taxi pull to the side of the road. I accelerated then to about 40 kilometers per hour in order to pass the taxi safely.
And how did you judge your speed?
I kept looking at my speedometer.
Please tell the court why you accelerated.
I had accelerated because I had moved my car to the center of the road and I had to quickly accelerate so as to pass the taxi safely.
When did you first observe the pedestrian?
I saw the pedestrian immediately as she moved in the path of my vehicle.
Why didn't you see the pedestrian before then?
The pedestrian got off the taxi on the other side of the taxi and was intending to cross the road in front of the taxi. So the pedestrian must have been hidden from my view from the taxi as I saw her immediately as she came in the path of my vehicle.
How much time passed between your seeing the pedestrian and the collision?
I saw the pedestrian almost at the same time as the collision happened.
What did you do when you saw the pedestrian?
I slammed on my brakes immediately with an intention to stop my vehicle. Unfortunately, the front of my vehicle collided with her.
Finally, Mr. Chauke, please tell the court what happened after the collision.
After the accident, I was in dire shock and didn't seem to be able to move. The first thing I noticed was the pedestrian laying nearby on the ground. A few of the pedestrians that were walking at different angles on the sidewalk moved in immediately to assist the pedestrian who was laying on the ground. One of the people who went over to assist the pedestrian was a paramedic. I was in shock and didn't seem to be able to move. One of the people came to my car, asked for my keys with an intention of moving my vehicle to the side of the road. I then allowed them while I sat on the side of the road, and almost immediately as they moved my car, a police vehicle arrived, and soon after that, an ambulance for the injured pedestrian.
Thank you, Mr. Chauke. You'll now be asked some questions by the plaintiff's counsel.
Yes, Advocate Kimani.
Mr. Chauke, you travel to work on Main Road every day, don't you?
Yes,
So you're aware of the vicinity of the University of Cape Town buildings and residences to Main Road Rondebosch.
yes, I was.
Have you often observed pedestrians crossing Main Road?
Yes,
And these pedestrians do not always use the pedestrian crossing, do they?
no, they don't.
So you need to be careful.
Yes,
Were there a number of pedestrians on the sidewalk on the morning of the 21st of April 2015?
yes. I saw a couple of pedestrians standing at the pedestrian crossing, waiting for the light of the robots to change.
And were all the pedestrians at or near the pedestrian crossing?
I can't be sure of that.
So those pedestrians may have been intending to cross the road without using the pedestrian crossing.
I can't be sure of that either.
You said that the minibus taxi pulled over to the side of the road and stopped near the sidewalk.
Yes,
Did you observe anyone disembarking from the taxi?
yes, I saw a couple people get off the taxi.
And were you aware that pedestrians usually cross the road after the disembarking?
Yes,
You said earlier that you see people try and cross the road at this point quite often.
yes,
So there was a possibility that one or some of the passengers who had just disembarked or the other pedestrians who were waiting on the sidewalk might try and cross the road.
I suppose so.
Was there a possibility or wasn't there?
There was a possibility.
And you decided to overtake the taxi despite this possibility?
Yes, I did.
Were all the pedestrians on the sidewalk within your sight at all times?
I think so.
Isn't it possible that some of the pedestrians may have been hidden from your view by the taxi?
Yes, that's possible.
So you decided to overtake the taxi, even though there may have been some pedestrians in the area whom you couldn't see.
Yes, I did.
You said that the taxi that was driving in front of you had been driving erratically and holding up traffic.
Yes, the taxi was driving very poorly.
So you would have been quite annoyed at the behavior of the driver.
Not really. I encounter taxis on a daily basis and I am used to such behavior.
But on this morning, because of the way the taxi was being driven, you decided to overtake it.
Yes, I did.
And you had to increase your speed in order to overtake it.
Yes.
Was that not a bit risky? Especially as you have said that there may have been some pedestrians in the area whom you couldn't see.
I needed to cross the road I needed to accelerate in order to pass the taxi safely.
Please answer the question. Wasn't it risky?
I didn't think so at the time.
You saw my client right before the collision, correct?
Yes.
Did you attempt to swerve in order to avoid hitting my client?
No, there was no time to swerve.
Well then, did you attempt to stop your vehicle to prevent the collision?
Yes. Immediately as I saw the pedestrian, I slammed on my brakes, but there was no time to stop my vehicle.
There would have been enough time for you to stop your vehicle if you had been traveling at a slower speed, wouldn't there?
I am not sure of that.
The fact is that you were traveling too fast to prevent a collision in case a pedestrian were crossing the road.
I was traveling at a safe speed.
Finally, Mr. Chauke, I would like to call the court's attention to the Highway Safety Code, page 11, on the duties of pedestrians and the pedestrian's right of way to cross a pedestrian crossing. Mr. Chauke, are you familiar with the Highway Safety Code that was published by the Department of Transport?
Yes, I am.
And did you say that you have passed your driver's test?
Yes.
Are you aware that paragraph 4 of the pedestrian's right of way in a pedestrian crossing states that a vehicle may not overtake a taxi which has been stopped to allow pedestrians to disembark?
Yes, I am aware of that provision.
No further questions.
Yes, thank you, Advocate Kimani. Any re-examination?
Yes, madam.
Please proceed.
Mr. Chauke, how often do you encounter taxis on your commute to work?
I encounter taxis on a daily basis as there are a lot of taxis on Main Road transporting people to and from work.
How much experience do you have dealing with taxis on the road?
I am very used to dealing with taxis on the road as I encounter them on a daily basis.
For how long had you been traveling behind the taxi before the collision?
I had not been traveling for long behind the taxi. I would say it was about a few minutes.
Why did you decide to overtake the taxi?
I still had plenty of time to get to work, but the taxi was driving very erratically. I then thought it might be safer to overtake the taxi as the opportunity to do so arose.
And what was your state of mind when you decided to overtake the taxi?
I may have been slightly annoyed by the erratic driving of the taxi driver. However, above all, I was concerned about my safety, as I thought the taxi would cause an accident.
What precautions did you take when overtaking the taxi?
I had already slowed down to about 20 kilometers per hour and fell back to a safe distance behind the taxi when I saw it pull over to the side of the road. I checked to make sure that there was a large enough gap in the approaching traffic, and I kept a lookout for the pedestrians that might be crossing the road.
Why didn't you see the pedestrian with whom you collided until the moment of just before the collision?
Immediately after the pedestrian disembarked the taxi, she crossed the road right in front of the taxi, of which the taxi had blocked my view from seeing her. The first opportunity I had to see the pedestrian was when she immediately ran in the path of my vehicle as I was overtaking the taxi.
You said that you accelerated to 40 kilometers per hour in order to overtake the taxi.
Yes,
What is the speed limit on Main Road?
the speed limit is 60 kilometers per hour.
Why were you traveling below the speed limit?
I felt that I needed to take special care, especially from the fact that the taxi was driving erratically. I was also aware that there are pedestrians on the side of the road who may or may not cross the road. So my speed was prompted by the fact that there might be people who ran in the path of my vehicle, and therefore I felt that I needed to take special care.
My lords, my ladies, that is the defense's case. Thank you.
Thank you, Advocate Owen. Thank you, Mr. Chauke. You may step down.
Thank you.
Closing addresses, Advocate Kimani.
Ms. Sakala has alleged that the defendant failed to meet the standard of care that is expected of a reasonable, prudent driver. And she also has alleged that the defendant's negligence caused the accident. Now, in this regard, the onus rests on the plaintiff. The defendant, on the other hand, has denied that he was negligent, or that his negligence contributed to the accident. In this regard, the onus rests on the defendant. Now, the court has had two versions of how this accident happened. One of them, which is Ms. Sakala's, the plaintiff's version, and the other one, which is that of the defendant. However, there are several things on which the two parties agree. They agree that the accident occurred on the morning of the 21st of April 2015. They agree that the accident occurred on Main Road, Rondebosch, at the intersection between Main Road and Woolsack Road. They agree that the minibus taxi in which Ms. Sakala was traveling pulled over and stopped at the sidewalk to allow passengers to disembark. They also agree that there's a pedestrian crossing about 50 meters away from the intersection. They also agree that there were a number of pedestrians on the sidewalk who were waiting to cross the road that morning. Nonetheless, there are some discrepancies in the two versions of the events. The plaintiff has told the court that she was traveling to the University of Cape Town to attend a class that morning. She signaled the driver to stop near the intersection between Main Road and Woolsack Road. She disembarked from the vehicle, walked over around to the front of the taxi, and waited until it was safe to cross the road. She has told the court that a couple of other people also disembarked from the taxi at the same time as her, and they were also standing on the sidewalk. These people, like Ms. Sakala, were waiting for an opportunity to cross the road. Ms. Sakala testified that she checked left and right and satisfied herself that it was safe to cross the road when she did. She observed the defendant's vehicle traveling towards her, and that was on the lane that was closest to her, but there appeared to be a sufficient gap between her position and that of the defendant for her to safely cross the road. At that time, the defendant was traveling about 100 meters behind the minibus taxi, and he was traveling at a moderate and slow speed, which gave her enough time to cross the road. Your Honors, the plaintiff satisfied herself, according to the duties of a pedestrian under the Highway Code, that there was no oncoming traffic before she stepped onto the road. Sure, she may have failed to use the pedestrian crossing, which was 50 meters away. But again, the Highway Code allows the pedestrian to cross the road either at a pedestrian crossing or at an intersection. Now, Ms. Sakala's version of how this accident occurred is that while she stepped into the road, the defendant significantly increased his speed in order to overtake the taxi, which was driving erratically. Now, the plaintiff had expected the defendant to maintain the same reasonable speed, given the proximity of pedestrians, the proximity of a passenger taxi, and she was taken off guard by the defendant approaching her position on the road so quickly. And this is why she had not checked left and right again before crossing the road. The defendant's vehicle collided with her while she was frozen in the road. She testified as to the number of injuries she suffered. She suffered a minor head injury, a severe injury to her right leg, and 4 fractured ribs. Your Honors, she took over 8 months to recover, and she had to disrupt her education. The defendant has admitted that he often observes pedestrians crossing at the intersection between Main Road and Woolsack Road. And furthermore, that they do not always use the pedestrian crossing. He further admitted that there were a number of pedestrians waiting to cross the road that morning, and one of those people included Ms. Sakala. He further admitted that he was not able to see all the people in that area when he was accelerating to overtake the taxi. And indeed, Ms. Sakala, the plaintiff, had been obscured from his view by the taxi when he was accelerating. In cross-examination, he also admitted to increasing his speed in order to overtake the taxi. The defendant said that he was traveling at 20 kilometers per hour and that he was 50 meters behind the minibus taxi, but that he accelerated, increasing his speed to about 40 kilometers per hour in order to overtake the taxi. Your Honors, he accelerated despite the proximity of pedestrians, despite the proximity of traffic lights at the intersection, despite the proximity of an intersection, and who knew when the lights were going to change to red. In fact, according to the testimony of Ms. Sakala, the defendant was traveling much faster than 40 kilometers per hour. Now, she's not qualified to estimate an exact speed, but from her recollection of the events of that day, the defendant was traveling much faster than he was when she saw him first. It appears, therefore, very likely that the defendant was traveling much faster than he testified himself. Once again, the defendant admitted to increasing his speed despite all the surrounding circumstances of an intersection. Now, if the defendant had not increased his speed, he would have had more time to stop his vehicle in the event of any pedestrian crossing at the intersection, which was highly likely, as he told us. he would have been able to prevent the collision between Ms. Sakala and himself. Now, the defendant's negligence in failing to adequately adjust his speed in response to all the surrounding circumstances fell below the standard of care expected of a reasonable and prudent driver while overtaking a vehicle. It was therefore the defendant's negligence that caused this accident. Therefore, we ask this court to find that the plaintiff has discharged her honors to prove that the defendant's negligence was a sole cause of accident which caused her such significant harm. Thank you, my lady.
Advocate Owen, your closing address.
My lords, my ladies, the plaintiff's counsel has alluded to some discrepancies between the evidence of the plaintiff and the evidence of the defendant. But the real issues before the courts are only two. The first one is whether the plaintiff's conduct in crossing the road under such circumstances fell below what would be expected of any reasonable and prudent road user in those circumstances. And the second issue would be whether the defendant acted as a prudent and reasonable man caught in the same circumstances when the accident occurred. Mr. Chauke has testified that the accident occurred when he was traveling to work, to his place of work. He told the court that he was traveling behind a minibus taxi which was driving erratically. He said also that because of the taxi that was driving erratically, he decided to overtake the taxi as soon as the opportunity arose. He had already slowed down to 20 kilometers per hour when he made the decision to overtake the taxi. But because he had to overtake the taxi, he had to accelerate to 40 kilometers per hour in order to overtake this taxi. So he decided to overtake the taxi. He decided to accelerate to 40 kilometers per hour, which is still below the speed limit of 60 kilometers per hour on Main Road. He also took a number of precautions when he decided to overtake the taxi. He indicated correctly. He moved to the center of the road. And he constantly kept a lookout for pedestrians. When the front of Mr. Chauke's car approached the front of the taxi, the plaintiff ran into the path of his vehicle. He told court that he immediately slammed on his brakes to try and avoid a collision. But there was very little time for him to avoid the collision. Mr. Chauke should not be held negligent. He was aware of the presence of pedestrians. And he was also aware of the presence of the passenger taxi. And because he was aware of that, he took a number of precautions in the way that he was driving. However, he could not have expected the plaintiff to run out of nowhere into the path of his vehicle, and yet there is a pedestrian crossing only 50 meters away from that particular intersection. And even if he was taken by surprise by the conduct of the plaintiff, he still did everything reasonable to avert the accident. He slammed on his brakes. But he could not avoid the collision due to no fault of his own. Instead, my lords, my ladies, it was the plaintiff who was negligent. Mr. Chauke testified, and the plaintiff also admitted to this, that the collision occurred just 50 meters away from the designated pedestrian crossing. The highway code that the plaintiff's counsel alludes to also places obligations on pedestrians. And particularly, if there is a designated pedestrian crossing within 50 meters, then a pedestrian is expected to use the designated pedestrian crossing. And if the pedestrian does not, that is illegal, and it would be called jaywalking. The plaintiff further admitted that she was aware that my client's vehicle was approaching her position when she decided to cross the road. But even if she was aware of this, nonetheless, she decided to cross the road. The plaintiff also admits that she was aware of the fact that any oncoming traffic would not have been able to see her, since she was hidden from view by the taxi from which she disembarked. And therefore, she must have been aware that any driver, including the defendant, would not have seen her. But she still decided to cross the road. The plaintiff has told the court that the accident was caused by the defendant drastically increasing his speed between her first seeing his vehicle and the collision. But she cannot tell the court what this speed could have been. She claims that the defendant was traveling at a fast speed. Mr. Chauke's version of how the accident occurred is far more likely. Mr. Chauke admits that he accelerated to 40 kilometers per hour, but he only did so in order to safely overtake the taxi, and that is after keeping a lookout for pedestrians. Mr. Chauke was able to determine his speed by constant reference to his speedometer, but the plaintiff is merely guessing. She observed the defendant's vehicle for such a short time and under such hard circumstances because she was rushing to class. It is not possible to accurately estimate the speed of a vehicle under such circumstances. The plaintiff also admits that there was no car approaching from the other lane, and therefore the defendant had no reason to be in a rush. Instead, it was her that was running late for her class. The most likely probability is that since she was running late for her class, she took a risk to cross the road in a rush and therefore stepped into the path of oncoming traffic without looking right again to check if it was safe to cross the road at that particular time. Therefore, I ask the court to find that the plaintiff has failed to discharge the obligation of showing that the defendant was negligent, and particularly that the defendant's conduct fell below that of a reasonable man. If the court finds against my client in these circumstances, I ask the court to find that the defendant has discharged his duty of proving that the plaintiff was contributory negligent. Thank you, my ladies. Thank you, my lords.
Thank you both for your closing submissions. The court will take time to consider the evidence that has been laid in this matter, together with the submissions that have been made by counsel. Judgment is accordingly reserved. Court adjourns.